Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at the Rhodes Forum after having to back out 2 years in a row for various reasons. Finally made it, and given the quality of discussions that I've been party to, of course, in this session, but also over the last 2 days, the loss has been entirely mine. In the 20-25 minutes that I have, I'd like to avoid repeating any of the excellent points that my fellow panelists have made and try to take the discussion, situate it in a slightly different context, and take the discussion more in the direction of how states are responding to and ought to respond to the problem of hybrid warfare. But let's start with the context, because hybrid warfare, in one way or the other, has been with humankind since the start of war. Why is it that there is renewed international focus on the concept? Why is there greater discussion about the threat posed by hybrid warfare, particularly in the strategic literature of the United States or North America and Western Europe, is, I think, a reflection of the international situation as it is today, which, if one were to describe it in telegraphic terms, is a situation of flux, instability, uncertainty, but one constant, which is that the United States and its alliance system, which has dominated international affairs for the last 70 years, today stands weakened, irreparably so. It retains elements of hegemonic power, but is in reality only quasi-hegemonic. That's what the decline of the United States and the alliance system of the United States has meant for the US and, of course, for the world. What do I mean by quasi-hegemonic? The United States and its allies still have the capacity, as a hegemonic power, to destroy or disrupt arrangements in different parts of the world. You can invade a country, you can set in motion war of one kind or the other, insurgencies of one kind or the other. You can contribute towards the destabilizing of a regime. You can engender insecurity. And all of these methods involve, in one way or the other, the use of American military power. What the US lacks, and this is, as I said, a defining characteristic of our era, is the other side of what hegemonic power is all about, which is the ability not just to destroy an existing arrangement, but also your ability to enforce a new one, to create a new order that serves your interest. And if we look at all the major interventions that the US has made after the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the end of the Cold War, we see partial success to abject failure. The Iraq invasion has not produced the kind of outcomes that the United States might have wanted in Iraq itself, let alone the wider West Asian region. The outcome in Libya, the outcome in Syria are far from ideal, no matter how you would define American national interest. And having failed to accomplish on the battlefield what the US set out to achieve in those regions, but also in other parts where tension with rising powers is increasing. The United States, in a way, recognizes the inadequacy of military power, of military power as military power, and both for itself and in the hands of its adversaries, is increasingly aware of the salience of what it calls hybrid warfare. And of course, it sees its adversaries using hybrid warfare, but also is a skilled and adept practitioner of the concept. 10 days before the Russian Federation decided to intervene militarily in Syria, the common refrain in the Western press about the nature of the conflict, the course of the conflict in Syria, was to lament the fact that insurgent groups, so-called good insurgent groups that the United States had been training and funding, had all been weakened, and many of them had defected to the camp of ISIS. This was the lament, that US policy had failed. There was no good opposition anymore. Everybody was collapsing into the arms of ISIS. Along comes Russia with this decision to intervene on the side of Damascus, and I'm not getting into the merits or demerits of the Russian involvement. That's a separate issue altogether. But it's amazing how the media discourse changes overnight. The people that the Russian Air Force is bombing, or Russian missiles are bombing, now are described as the good opposition, the same good opposition which we were told no longer existed, or which had been weakened to such an extent where they were irrelevant. And you can see now a classic example of one aspect of hybrid warfare, which is the use of, or the attempt to use the media as, in military parlance, a force multiplier. And we've seen this repeatedly on the eve of and during the course of conflicts involving the US and NATO. I covered the NATO aggression against Yugoslavia in 1999 as a reporter for the Times of India, and was struck by the kind of language that many of my Western colleagues would adopt uncritically in describing NATO bombing of Belgrade or other civilian areas, the way they would describe civilian casualties, the eagerness with which they would embrace facts as they were put out by the NATO official spokesperson, while being extremely skeptical about anything that the Yugoslav side said. And this is a pattern we see in conflict all over the place. But the US, for the United States, the use of the media has always been an important element of military strategy, knowing how to use it, how to push it in a certain direction. And as I said, this is because hybrid warfare in one form or the other has been around for a long time. It's a fancy title that, to my mind, essentially forms a special case of what we all know as asymmetric warfare. When you have two adversaries fighting each other, and one adversary, typically the weaker one, is able to draw upon methods of opposition, fighting, resistance, warfare, whatever you want to call it, that the other side doesn't have easy access to. Chances are that the more powerful adversary will resent this. Asymmetric warfare is, of course, it's not a loaded term, but hybrid warfare is something which takes on a normative dimension. There's a sense in which this is illegitimate in some way. And it shouldn't surprise us that today states at the receiving end of asymmetric responses are the ones who level this charge. And virtually every state at one point or the other is capable of and actually does level this charge against its adversaries. If you just look at the headlines of the last 2 or 3 weeks or the last couple of months, so the US accuses Russia of indulging in hybrid warfare because of the manner in which Crimea was annexed and the manner in which the Russian side intervened or is suspected of having intervened in the eastern Ukraine. And this, in North American military literature, is considered the classic modern example of hybrid warfare, where a state takes recourse to the use of irregulars, to the use of ethnic links with local populations, to the use of media, and essentially uses these tools to pursue military objectives that perhaps are not that easily pursued through the use of conventional military means. And in the eyes of NATO or American military analysts, Ukraine, Crimea are the textbook case of course, of hybrid warfare, and they believe Russia as the main beneficiary of this. The Russians, on the other hand, not without credibility, are able to invoke the same charge against the United States. Now, the term hybrid warfare has come into currency in recent months and years, but in one way or the other, elements of what this hybrid warfare involves, the promotion of color revolutions, NGOs of one kind or the other, has been identified by Moscow as a constant in Washington's policy across the former Soviet Union. And if you were to talk to the Russians, they'll say, well, we have been the victims of hybrid warfare for the last 20 years, in one way or the other. Israel accuses Hamas and Hezbollah of engaging in hybrid warfare. Their charge, for example, of the use of human shields, which is the pretext every time civilians get killed by Israeli bombing, that the other side resorted to a form of hybrid warfare by using human shields, thus causing civilian casualties so that we get blamed, we get embarrassed. India accuses Pakistan of engaging in a form of hybrid warfare by sponsoring non-state organizations of one kind or the other, terrorist groups, jihadi groups, who then cross the line of control in order to stage terrorist attacks in India, giving the Pakistani state an element of plausible deniability. Nepal, in recent weeks, has accused India of a form of hybrid warfare by enforcing an unofficial blockade of the India-Nepal land border as a means of putting pressure on the Nepalese government to amend its constitution so that it gives greater rights to a segment of its population on the India-Nepal border that has ethnic ties with the Indian side. And Nepal has complained in the United Nations. Other accusations, other forms of accusations that we see, unconnected to the Cold War in a sense, but Bolivia, the government of Bolivia, Evo Morales, has accused 3 prominent NGOs who are active in the environment space of conducting their activism on behalf of foreign powers. In India, the government of Narendra Modi has also targeted environmental organizations, Greenpeace, for example, saying that these environmental NGOs are somehow out to sabotage India's growth and development efforts by raising environmental concerns, and that again this is being done in some ways at the behest of foreign powers. So we see that the accusation of or seeing in a whole range of actions, and the actions that I've described, which states are objecting to, form a continuum, right? You have at one end a form of hybrid warfare using proxies that approximates actual warfare, because if you're financing, as India accuses Pakistan of doing, if you're financing or permitting terrorist groups to operate, then that's as close to regular warfare as it gets, and that's at one extreme end of the continuum, or the American allegation against Russia of arming and financing irregulars of one kind or the other. And at the other end of the continuum, you have accusations such as the government of Bolivia, the government of India, levels against its own NGOs, which takes the form of an accusation of hybrid warfare, but in reality may be quite different. And I want to go through the different forms that hybrid warfare appears to, or the allegations, or the kind of issues around which the allegations surface, so that we are clear in terms of methodology as to what these issues are, and we, in a way, apply some element of discrimination in analyzing and assessing the merits or demerits of these. Because if we don't do that, then we may make fundamental mistakes in trying to understand or trying to prescribe how different aspects of what are called, hybrid threats should be dealt with in the states where these threats occur or manifest. And the easiest one, the easiest vector of hybrid warfare that one can analyze and discuss and find ways to deal with is the most kinetic one, right? Which is the use of proxies or the use of the supplying of weaponry to irregulars. As Mr. Black said, this goes back a long way. The Contras. This is a staple of the Cold War, where the superpowers chose not to fight each other but fought through proxies. We're familiar with this. And states, in their own ways, that have been victims of this have developed responses. In other words, you fight it out. If you have armed mercenaries or groups that are on your territory, as the Nicaraguans found when they were confronting the menace of the Contras, you are within your rights to seek military assistance from countries that want to back you. And this is a fairly well understood problem, and doesn't, in a way, there's nothing very novel in say what's happening in the Ukraine or the allegation that the US is making against Russia, because we've seen these kinds of allegations. We've seen the use of proxies in Cold War contexts in the past. The fact that it's happening now is a little alarming. It tells us a little bit about the direction in which relations between the US and Russia are going and what this may mean for global affairs. But as an analytical concept, the fact that that one power finances armed proxies who then engage in military acts on the soil of another country is a fairly easy concept to get one's head around. The next prominent form in which hybrid threats manifest themselves is the entire class of the array of legal or quasi-legal, or if we accept, which I do, Mr. Black's characterization of sanctions as illegal. But you have this array of seemingly legal forms of coercion, where it's not convenient for one adversary to militarily confront another, and you then resort to legal or sort of quasi-legal means by either unilaterally declaring sanctions against a country, or getting a group of nations to follow your sanctions, or in some cases getting the United Nations to act essentially in pursuit of a goal that is a product of your own national interest. And we've seen the United States being the most skillful in suborning international organizations and getting them to declare sanctions against one adversary or the other, essentially as a second best or a more effective option to full-fledged warfare. We've discussed our chairperson began with a description of the impact that the sanctions on Iraq had on the population of that country, and the kind of civilian death toll that this caused. But if I were to look at a recent example of a successful example of using international institutions and international law as cover for waging warfare, in a sense, against a sovereign country, I would say a textbook case is the manner in which the United States used allegations of Iran pursuing a nuclear military program, steered them very successfully through the IAEA with the collusion of a number of countries, and managed to then get the IAEA governing body to indict Iran on fairly flimsy ground, and have the file then sent to the United Nations Security Council, where it managed to then impose sanctions on the Islamic Republic, essentially as a means of putting pressure on Tehran to compromise on aspects of its nuclear energy program that Iran was unwilling to do. And when the United States found that the sanctions, in other words, the international system was flexible enough for the US to push an indictment of Iran through the IAEA governing body, and to have the file reach the Security Council. But when it came to the Security Council, the Russians and the Chinese and a number of other members were not very keen to have the kind of sort of heavy-handed sanctions on Iran that the US would want to have imposed. So after a year or so of sanctions which the US felt were inadequate in terms of strangling the Iranian oil industry and putting pressure on the Iranian financial system, the US then resorted to extraterritoriality, imposing unilateral sanctions, getting the collusion of the European Union, and then using the fact that banks around the world have operations in the US or Europe, using that as a lever to ensure that, or to put pressure on countries such as India, for example, that was a major importer of Iranian oil. And even though India voted at the Board of Governors of the IAEA to refer the Iranian file, it did so with a great deal of reluctance and coming under a lot of pressure from the US. Certainly, India was not interested in a situation where we would be stopped from buying Iranian oil. And but the way in which these extraterritorial sanctions work, it became virtually impossible for India to find a way to make dollar payments to the Iranian side for the oil that it was importing, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years before the Iran P5+1 nuclear deal. And so we can see, how the United States is able to use the fact that in a globalized world, banks, shipping companies, insurance companies, oil companies have vital operations in the US and in West Europe, and how the US is able to use these connections in order to put pressure on a country and essentially in pursuit of objectives that cannot be accomplished all that easily by conventional warfare. How does one deal with this kind of pressure is something I'll come to at the end of my paper. The third form in which it's worth taking note of hybrid warfare, and again, this is something which has come to the fore in the last 5 years or 6 years, or I would say last 2 years, with the disclosures made by Edward Snowden, is of course the entire field of cyber security, cyber espionage, cyber snooping. And here, a number of countries woke up to the unpleasant truth that even though they consider themselves to be military allies of the United States, Germany, for example, or France, or very close trading partners, India and Brazil, they found that their computer systems were considered legitimate targets for the swooping up of wholesale data by the NSA. They found that their leaderships were being targeted, their phones were being bugged, their computer systems were being hacked into by the US NSA on a systematic basis. And this is again a classic example of a new form of warfare, and it raises all kinds of challenging international legal questions. Again, you see double standards being resorted to. The hack conducted on the so-called OPM hack in the United States generated, justifiably so at some level, a lot of anger and anxiety about the security of computer systems in the US, and very soon turned into pretty belligerent finger-pointing at China. The fact that the US has been doing, has been snooping, picking up data, and does not respect the confidentiality of financial or other information that it is able to pick up from countries around the world hardly excited any adverse commentary. The hostility with which the mainstream American press has greeted Edward Snowden and the revelations he made, despite the fact that He has highlighted for the American public the kind of dangers, that they are subjected to, the kind of compromises that their privacy is subjected to, is something which does not speak well about the nature of American civil society. But essentially, the cyber threat is, if I were to describe this continuum of hybrid threats that the world confronts today, the cyber threat would be in number 3. The fourth position, the fourth class or cluster of hybrid threats is now we're getting into analytically slightly more difficult territory, both in terms of describing the threat and in terms of trying to craft a suitable response. So this class of threats are, broadly speaking, those that belong to the information, social media, propaganda, this arena. And here, John's paper described the manner in which the United States was involved in crafting the kind of, or birthing the kind of political institutions which Europe thought were its own, and which today Europe believes is its contribution to humankind. And we see the kind of geopolitical and political economic role that those institutions played, and the subtle manner in which the United States was able to do it. But there is perhaps no arena of human creativity in the last 6 decades where there hasn't been some kind of an American program. We know, for example, that that State Department officials, despite hating jazz and despite being very racist in their outlook towards black performers and African Americans in general, were actively involved in sending jazz musicians on world tours all over different countries. We know that the Dulles brothers, who had utter contempt for modern art, nevertheless believed that promoting American-style modern art across the world was something which served American geopolitical interests, and this was done very actively, the idea being to reinforce the idea that America is a country of great freedom and creativity, and so on and so forth. So even though these were art forms or music forms that the American establishment had utter contempt for and certainly didn't understand or appreciate, they were not above using this sort of thing. We know from the Congress for Cultural Freedom that in the battle of ideas in the realm of literature, the US was very involved. And of course they were involved and perhaps are still in many, many ways in terms of pushing the media in this direction or that. Social media, even though whenever these things leak, they leak in a way that, so even the quote we saw from Samantha Power's husband was more about being anonymously activating ourselves in chat rooms to counter harmful propaganda. But every bit of benign intervention that you do also comes with the capacity to do the opposite. And so there's no telling, because in the absence of any kind of checks or balances or oversight, how these instrumentalities which are created finally end up getting used. And I think here the role of information manipulation, information targeting, propaganda, the fueling of ensuring the virality of certain kinds of news, certain clips on YouTube, the way in which, for example, we saw, I'm still agnostic about the full facts surrounding the downing of the Malaysian plane over Ukraine, but from time to time you see video clips that pop up that then circulate, achieve a great deal of virality, and which serve a certain kind of narrative purpose. And there's no telling whether these clips emerge accidentally or are they part of a hybrid warfare strategy. There's no telling at all. Now, the US is not the only one to make use of social media. ISIS, which is, has in a way has mastered the art of information warfare, primarily to spread terror and a sense of panic among populations where it hopes to take power and to, in a way, terrorize its opponents. And we see, across the board. I mean, recently in India, for example, there was, video. There's a political controversy right now with the ruling party over the issue of consumption of beef. So in India, cow slaughter is illegal in most parts of the country. And the ruling party is trying to make this into a big political issue because, of course, it's a Muslim population that largely eats beef. So as part of a political strategy, this issue has been, there's an attempt to play up this issue. And I recently got on WhatsApp a video that, because I've been to Pakistan many times and one knows the way, this was a clip clearly from Pakistan of a cow being slaughtered. And the accompanying text that came along with the video was that this is what Muslims in India are doing. So there's a lot of mischief mongering that's happening. Social media is being used by political activists, by political parties, by agents provocateurs. We don't know exactly how these things happen, but this is, so the use and subversion of media is something. And of course, the final form of hybrid threats is the civil society vector, and here this is the most complex because we do know that there are civil society organizations that are promoted and pushed by foreign powers, foreign governments, but we also know, and this is where we enter into very difficult terrain, we also know that accusing an opponent of being a proxy for a foreign power is a very convenient allegation for a government that is not the most democratic government. It's a very convenient allegation for them to make. We've seen this in many, many countries in the Middle East, in Russia. We see this in India, where it's very easy for the Prime Minister to, so there is an environmental issue, and there is a problem with tribals being kicked off their land in order to make it easier for mining companies to engage in mining. So I know, speaking from my experience in India, that there is a domestic vital issue here that concerns people, and that these are not shills or agents of any foreign power, but it becomes a very easy label for the government to attach. I've virtually run out of time, but in the 1 minute that I have left, with the Chair's permission, I think ensuring hybrid warfare or hybrid threats come in a whole continuum. And each of these have their own specificity. Learning how to deal with them and respond to them is essential. It's important in handling particularly those threats that came at the end of my continuum, which is involving civil society, involving the media, that states in responding to this threat do not compromise on the democratic freedoms that any vibrant society requires and needs. And this is a fine line. Often governments tend to cross that line, citing foreign threats. And as far as the international law dimension is concerned, it's essential that the same rules of the road that govern warfare in general must carry over to hybrid warfare too. So if Article 2, 4, and 2.7 of the UN Charter dealing with the ban on use of force or non-intervention apply to what we consider to be conventional methods of intervention, conventional methods of warfare, then there needs to be greater discussion so that this prescription, even if it's not adhered to, but this prescription, at least in form and on paper, must carry over to non-conventional forms of warfare as well. Thank you very much.